We certainly live in interesting times. Many people even feel as if some end of the world moment has arrived, some kind of brink that we have reached. And certainly you wouldn't be remiss for thinking so. It seems as if either everybody is at each other's throats or everyone is just running around not knowing what next. Not only our own government, but many governments around the world are being perceived as self-interested, unable to cater to the needs of their populations, and frequently interested only in winning their political battles and pursuing their selfish interests, rather than dealing with the needs of the masses and the needs of the people in their countries. We know that many South Africans feel that way, but many people around the world seem to be disenchanted with their governments and with the state of the world itself. More than that, people feel as if we've arrived at a point where even a third world war is possible or even imminent. People look at the crisis in the Russian-Ukraine conflict and see that as potentially escalating into a third world war. People look at the divisions in America, the growing division in America, and the possibilities if another Trump presidency or other divisive style of presidency becomes the next rule for that country. Certainly entirely possible. We're not here to predict whether there's going to be a Trump presidency. And indeed, we can only look so far. But what is important to understand, and important to understand in our predictions and how those predictions are done, is that astrology is about how time works through cycles and circles. The way we measure time is circular. We measure cycles of time and we recognize them throughout nature. Certainly, I believe that the reason why astrology works is because it is based on that premise. People often assume or think that astrology is about the influence of the planets on us, as if there was some invisible force that allowed them not only to influence us, but in some weird microscopic way, able to influence how we think and act. I think what is much more likely is that astrology is about how our natural cycles work. We witness these natural cycles everywhere else in nature, in plants and animals, and even in the earth itself as it goes through its various seasons. And yet we readily deny those cycles in ourselves. We're so sure of our free will that we disregard the fact that we too go in cycles. We know it, we talk about how history repeats itself, and yet we seem to do little to prevent history from repeating itself. It's like we know about cycles, but we don't really want to believe that they apply. We think everything is fresh and new and that we are unique and somehow we better than those who came before us, that we won't make the same mistakes that they did. We always believe that we know more than the previous generations and that finally we have solved all the problems of humankind, not the least of which is war. We talk about a next war as if the thought of that is completely impossible, as if we finally put an end to war. And in so doing, we once again cast aside the age-old knowledge that everything is cyclical, everything repeats itself, and if there has been war before, there will be war again. Frequently, idealists talk about that end of war as if time is an arrow that is forever going through progress. And astrology is very clear that time is not an arrow, that it is in fact a circle. And that also means that if there has been war before, there will certainly be war again. Does that mean we face a third world war now? Well, astrology is the tool that we developed to measure those cycles, to identify what stage of a cycle we're on and what we can expect. Just like when we look at a clock, we're measuring a cycle and able to use past knowledge to identify what to expect next. For example, when the clock says 1 o'clock in the middle of the day, we can use past knowledge to know that I'll be hungry, so will 80% of people be hungry and are likely to start eating somewhere within the next hour. It's that sophisticated kind of clock that ancient people developed literally over thousands of years in order to measure the cycles and behaviors of human beings. And our warlike behavior, our tendency for things to erupt in war at certain points has been, of course, one of the important focuses of measuring such cycles. So what we're going to do today is have a look at some of how those cycles are operating right now in the world and identify whether we can see how bad is the world really? Are we at a brink? Are we at a crisis point unlike anything we've seen before? Do we have something to fear? If so, what is it? And if not, when does this end? What can we expect next? Astrologers predicted war for more or less this period for quite some time. Many astrologers, including myself, are on record as expecting a serious, perhaps global conflict to begin in 2020. It turned out that the global conflict that was predicted for 2020 was, at least at first, of course, the arrival of the coronavirus pandemic and the ensuing 2 years that we are still dealing with the second year of. So that is an ongoing process that, while it will gradually move away from being a pandemic, is not yet the complete phase that astrologers have spoken about. Most astrologers expected the whole dramatic cycle of the early 2020s to last until 2024 in its primary phase, and as far as 25 and maybe even 26, until it starts the writing and the correction and the beginning of a longer next phase in our historical processes, our political processes. So that means that where we stand in 2022 is still very much in the midst of a period of upheaval and social and global revolution. These things are not terribly unusual. They occur every 30 to 40 years in some way or the other, always relating to large astrological cycles that anticipate the kinds of changes that we do see. And the cycle that began in 2020 is a cycle of extreme crisis, extreme austerity, death, poverty, all the economic changes that we've seen, the pandemic, and now, of course, the war in Russia, Ukraine, although it must be emphasized that there are many wars on the planet at any given time, and there are other wars that have started or been ongoing as 2020 dawned and as we stand now. And we have to at least concede that the media and the dominant powers draw our attention to which war is going on where. So when we talk about the significance of a war, it is pretty much by default slanted according to how things are presented to us. And perhaps more than ever, we live in an age where things are slanted by the media and, of course, as we know, by social media. Nevertheless, the end result is the same. These cycles have been experienced before, just in different ways and with different technologies. And so in that sense, there is nothing new as to what's going on. When we look at that war on Ukraine itself, looking at it from the point of view of, is this the start of a third world war, is not something that we could clearly do. But given the prevailing astrological circumstances, there isn't a good sign of a third world war anymore, especially as we go on further and further from the beginning of this war some 5 or 6 weeks ago. The crunch was 2020, and that's why the pandemic remains the main demonstration of the astrological forces. But yet only a beginning. As we know, even the pandemic allowed for changes in laws about civil rights and allowed variously freedom of the press and civil rights around the world, and in countries where those things had been previously praised and elevated to the extreme, to reach kind of the lowest level they have in decades. So there certainly are very real signs that the effects of the 2020 configurations are by no means over. And we are still facing the repercussions of them, and we'll see very much more. Also, if we see further political changes, say in the United States, as we know that if former President Trump becomes the president again, his divisive way of managing his rule might bring his own country to a kind of brinkmanship of its own. So we're living in an area where lots of different conflicts around the world and in particular places add to the increased chaos and the increased economic problems of what we could face. Because so many people though are concerned about this Ukraine situation, looking over there, we can see it persisting very much in the conditions we see it now, where it's a push-pull, not really a stalemate, but it's a situation which seems to be dragging out and grinding out. And while certainly, objectively, Ukraine looks like it's in a weaker position, it's a smaller country with a smaller armed force, and the world has yet really to come to its assistance other than through non-military means, meaning that the supposed might of Russia should eventually overwhelm it. But the interesting thing is that Ukraine and Russia were born pretty much at the same time, the modern Russia and modern Ukraine. And so they face many of the same kinds of cycles at the same time. And what is evident in their charts, especially starting right now, the last week of March, is that increasing stalemate that will dramatically erode the countries, their armed forces. We're seeing terrible devastation in Ukraine and people dying, and we're seeing the equivalent in terms of loss of life and the military, the Russian military, not really advancing very much in their efforts as that push-pull happens. This is very strong throughout this last week of March, and through the rest of the year, we can see it again in August and as far as December. And that tells us that it's very likely that the conflict is working in the same way, that it drags on and off throughout at least this year, if not longer. Certainly from the astrological point of view, it doesn't look like there can be any quick resolution or ending in sight. And it's like a grinding away at each other until very little is really left. Well, then logically, that's going to mean Ukraine suffers the most, being a smaller country in every way. But, it doesn't look very good for Russia. And it does look like in both countries, we can see the existing conflict lasting until about January of next year as this push-pull up and down of an unfinished business. So where the negotiations happen, drag things out further, the actual conflict doesn't look like there are any significant changes until January of next year, although there are some ups and downs and pauses. What is interesting, though, is in June of this year, in Russia's own astrological chart, there are conditions which suggest that it starts becoming quite serious for Russia in terms of its position in the world and where it stands. It might find, for example, enemies in unexpected places, say China or other former Soviet countries like Belarus or whatever, that are no longer supporting it by then. Certainly, it looks like Russia itself reaches a crunch in the middle of this year, and that may dampen down the situation into somewhat of a Cold War, but it's a Cold War with lots of hot flare-ups that can last all the way until January of next year. And in a kind of a larger picture, that process can spread further throughout next year and all the way till the middle of this decade, which will be early 2025. It won't be an ongoing war of this scale until then, but as a war of attrition, as a Cold War with flare-ups, as a standoff between Russia and the West, all the things that are emerging out of this and the enormous economic consequences for all sides clearly continue until 2025. What is of concern is that there are signs that the war can spread to other parts of Eastern Europe, and that presumably involves some of those other former Soviet republics. So it just looks like an increasing amount of uncertainty and fragmentation and potentially war in that area. And then at a larger level, the battle between Russia and NATO at a political level is obviously going to feed into that as well. It doesn't look like it's going to escalate to the level of a world war where Russia is shooting nuclear missiles into this conflict that then escalates. But it certainly looks like that war of attrition is going to spread further and also emerge as violence elsewhere in the world in the same period lasting until January 23, and that is an increase of tension and violence in various places, including the United States, where, of course, in 2023, they start building towards their next election. And that's where you're going to see more conflict and violence than you saw in the build up to the previous elections. So that is in danger of causing serious conflict in that country. There are many astrologers who have, in fact, some of the greatest astrologers of the modern world have predicted very serious conflicts in the United States to the point at which it might break into more than one country. That is not predicted for the immediate future, and that's still in the decades ahead, as these are the seeds of great conflict that we can see being planted. But certainly in the years from now through until 2026 and beyond, we are seeing these seeds turning into things which will become very difficult to change and which will probably lead to much greater dissolution in that country and even the possible breakdown of the United States itself. The world itself is also showing a crisis period that turns into economic crisis and various war around the world, especially in the aforementioned areas, building to a final crisis period from mid-2025 to early 2026. Sounds far away. Remember, this is not a continuous war, but also remember that many wars have lasted that long, and it always seemed impossible before they started. Now we're seeing different levels of war. On the one hand, war of attrition. We also know about cyber attacks. Can be also Russia's retaliation for the economic sanctions that have been imposed on it. That'll be an escalation of that. So when we address finally the question of what is the state of the world and where is this going to? The state of the world is that the 2000s have led to a protracted period from 2020 to 2026 of epidemic, war, and cyber attack that dramatically affects the economics of the world, the stability of the world, and the structures that lead to wars, structures such as countries, Ukraine, and NATO, and perhaps even other economic structures as well. What we are seeing, which is not really unprecedented, is a rise up of different people around the world who've kind of had enough. And you know, what I've said since the beginning of the pandemic era of 2020, looking at what the astrological circumstances were around that, is that we're at a point of the old versus the new. Not a unique point, they do come every 4 decades or so, but where the seeds are then laid during a period of austerity and conflict for greater positive changes ahead. So for example, these conditions were there in the early 1980s when the AIDS epidemic emerged. It was pushed underground. There were enormous political challenges Countries refused to recognize that the AIDS virus and pandemic existed, and that caused a level of social organization and of activist organization that started underground, which would lead to eventually to a rise of a new civil rights movement that in the end would lead to a world 30 years later where many countries around the Western world had legal gay marriage, when in the early 1980s, that was pretty much an impossible thought. But that was where gay activists, the people then most affected by HIV/AIDS, went into a deeper, more political mode with a stronger crisis on their hands. But the 1980s, the early 1980s, was a time of political and economic austerity and challenge to the masses. That is what we see each time, and that's what leads to greater political and social changes. The end result is that although we have to go through 5 or 6 years to 2026 of great difficulty, fear, lots of death, lots of war and uncertainty, it's not unprecedented. We've had to live through these things before, and no doubt we will do so again. In this case, we've also got huge environmental challenges that need to be resolved. And in the long run, what I believe will emerge out of this in the decades ahead is social, political, policy changes, which lead to better environmental management, as well as the social and political changes that, in the same way as civil rights movements were reborn in the 80s, reborn in the early 60s, will be reborn again at some level. We know that we still have enormous problems with gender-based violence and with gender issues, enormous problems with that, as well as various other economic things which do not reflect the philosophies of the world that we live in now. Enormous amounts of change has to happen at the economic level to gain a world of greater equality. That's not going to emerge out of any one period of conflict like this one. There will always be rich and poor. There'll always be the battles of those economic forces in one way or the other. There's no idealistic end to all of this because, as I said at the beginning of all of this, there is no arrow of history. It would be great to believe that finally we're here solving the problems of history, moving on from all that pain and grief that we've suffered from all the previous generations, and human beings can finally live happily ever after. It doesn't end like that because it doesn't end. It's a circle that has no beginning or end. All we can try and do is manage the situation as best as we can. Manage it so that human beings live more safely and more easily and more fairly as best as possible. It's always a work in progress. And it's these periods of crisis that help illustrate it and push us into action to try and improve the lot of our fellow human beings and our fellow creatures on the world. As I said, it's not an end game. It won't lead to an Eden where finally those things are just fine. But the work in progress means we're always trying to improve. We're always trying to burn the old karma of the baggage of the past that we carry. And these periods are astrologically periods of old versus new. And at the very, very least, that leads to opportunity. It's an opportunity to do better or to aspire to better. We can't stop the world from having wars and economic conflicts. We have to live through 6 years, 2020 to 2026, 6 or 7 years of great difficulty and conflict. But those will end and things will normalize again. Although in a couple of decades, they're back. So all we can do is look and see how can we improve things so that during those couple of decades, people still continue to solve the problems of a planet with increasing population and decreasing resources, because that's the ultimate reality. Even if there were an Edenic end to war, the reality remains that there's too many people and too little resources, and that human beings on the whole are destructive, destroy the planet and destroy other species. That isn't going to magically change no matter who wins a war or who puts a stop to a war. That is the reality we have to face. But what we can always do at a group level, at a global level, the very same task that is given to us at an individual level, the only thing that we can do is try to become more conscious and more loving. That is the only possibility that we have to try and improve ourselves. And if we all did that, that's how we could at least improve the planet. So we've got to look at the state of the world. And instead of thinking, oh, there's a disaster ahead, we're really in the disaster, is rather to think, how can I let this push me to try and grow my consciousness, grow the awareness and consciousness of everyone around me? Consciousness meaning understanding about other human beings, other species, the planet itself, and spirit. And how can I create better connections through love? Because the only way war ends, if it were ever to end, is when love and connection replaces it. That sounds like an Edenic ideal, but there's nothing stopping it being a forever lasting work in progress. Stay peaceful, stay safe, stay loving. I'll be back the next week at the same time.